I'm Gwendolyn Beetham, and I am the Associate Director of the Program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Penn. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you today to the final talk of the year in our Collective Conversations Alumni Series. The series is in its inaugural year, and it was created to provide a forum for GSWS scholars to present their work not only to GSWS affiliated alum, and we have at least one here today, but to the broader community. So if you're interested in presenting your work and you're part of the community as part of the series, or if you have any questions or want to suggest others who might want to present their work, please get in touch with me or my colleague, Maria Murphy, who's here today and who really set up this excellent lineup this year for the series. I could put my email in the chat and maybe Maria will as well. I'm going to introduce Dr. Julia Bloch now. I think many of you know her, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. So Dr. Bloch is the author of 3 books of poetry, including Letters to Kelly Clarkson, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and The Sacramento of Desire, published in early 2020, indeed, as she just mentioned, right before COVID. She's writing a scholarly book about race, gender, and lyric theory, is a Pew Fellow in the arts, and works and teaches here at Penn, where she is director of the creative writing program. And we are happy to say a member of the executive board of GSWS at Penn. So Julia is going to give a brief craft talk, as she's called it, followed by a short reading, or maybe the other way around, from the Sacramento of Desire. And then we'll open for questions, and we encourage you to post questions in the chat as we go. We'll turn on the live transcript for accessibility, which you can adjust as a feature in your settings. And without any more from me, oh, there it goes. Thank you so much and welcome, Julia.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. Thank you, Maria. Thank you for GSWS for hosting this. I am really excited to talk for a few minutes about the craft behind the book and then share some poems from the book. And I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. I just have a modest little PowerPoint. So the title of this craft talk is Clocking Reproductive Time on Poetic Forms in the Sacramento of Desire, and forms is plural, but I'm really going to focus on one particular form because it's the form that kind of governs the biggest first section of the book. But I actually want to begin with a different poet altogether. So there's a 2016 book by Monica Yoon, and it's about Yoon's own IUI and IVF cycles. But the poems also consider what assisted reproductive technologies have to do with capital. There are 2 poems titled Blackacre in this book, which itself is also called Blackacre. And the first Blackacre poem reads, and that's this first slide up here. One day they showed me a dark moon ringed with a bright nimbus on a swirling gray screen. They called it my last chance for never-ending life. But the next day it was gone. It had already launched itself into the gray sky like an escape capsule, accidentally empty, sent spiraling into the unpeopled galaxies of my trackless gray body. So the poem is a kind of blank of gray. There's screen and sky and an empty, lifeless body. There's a faceless bay, maybe a set of anonymous medical personnel. There's a whole galaxy empty of the babies being dreamt of. And there's also the promise of futurity, or what Yoon has called never-ending life, because in a way, futurity never ends, even if it's not here, even if it's already here. I've been writing about Yoon's book for a research project about a concept I'm calling reproductive time. So this is actually different from the project that Gwendolyn mentioned in the intro. I'm finishing up this book on lyric theory, but I have this second research project on reproductive time. And in that project, I situate poems like Yoon's within broader discourses around reproduction and capital, around reproductive futurity and pessimism and utopianism and temporality. And in the research project, I'm writing in and through and toward the ambivalent feelings that punctuate poems about the links between assisted reproduction and capitalism, or IVF and factory farming, or patriarchy and sperm donation and white supremacy. I'm interested in writing in and through these discourses for what they could say about the experience of wanting a different kind of future attached to the making of queer kinship structures. Yoon's book is not necessarily about those queer kinship structures, but it is one of the texts that I'm looking at that gets to something I find interesting about property. And I just want to take a step back and say I recognize I'm not at all talking about my own work at this moment, but one of the things that I discovered in writing The Sacramento of Desire was that it was impossible not to talk about other poets and not to talk about other poems, and lots of other poems, in fact, come into the poems that I myself wrote. So there's a second poem in Monica Yoon's book called Blackacre, which is actually a sequence of 14 poems that function as an interpretive essay on conception, but also as an annotative essay on Milton's Sonnet 19 on his blindness, so that the nothingness of the Blackacre rhymes with the oblivion suggested by Milton's poem on aging. Milton's sonnet reads, and I'll show it here on the screen, but I'll read just the first few lines. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me, useless. So Milton's poem functions as a set of kind of tags for Monica Yoon, who picks out each final word of each of the 14 lines. So you get spent, wide, denied, need, state, and so forth, to headline a miniature essay. She dismembers Milton's lyric and then essayistically reassembles it. So for example, here's section 13, which is written from Milton's penultimate line. And I'll just read the last stanza of Yoon's poem here. Rest, those who are left when thousands have sped away, the bereft who litter the land with husks for hands, vacant-eyed, vacant faces raised like basins under the contrail scarred sky. It's a poem of spaces, discarded husks, scarred skies, weirdly empty fruit skins. It's not difficult to read an empty womb into this poem, particularly its middle stanza, a shape built to hold nothing. In a brief note at the back of her book, Yoon writes, the term Blackacre is a legal fiction, a standard placeholder term used to denote a fictional plot of land, often a bequest, much as the term John Doe is used to indicate a fictional or anonymous individual. Ever since I encountered Yoon's book, I've been puzzling over the word fictional. And I've Googled law textbooks that use the word Blackacre in precisely this way, as in this entry from a book called Property. Faye owns Blackacre, and as owner of Blackacre, she has an easement for egress and ingress over Greenacre. Faye subdivides Blackacre, selling subdivided lots to 20 different people and retaining a lot for herself. A Blackacre then is simply a generically attributed plot of land, but it's a plot of land whose ownership is contested. So there's this generic quality, but also this incredibly contested quality. In Yoon's poems, a uterus is also a kind of space whose emptiness might somehow also be contested as to its ownership or its future. Poetry like this can say something about the lived experience of desiring a future outside terms of ownership or property or temporality, as difficult as it is to live underneath and through those terms. In 2014, I began writing a series of prose poems about fertility and about living underneath those terms. I sought a form, a kind of variable enjambment across page breaks that would permit the poems to shuttle between continuity and segmentation, and that would imitate the starts and stops of memory and wanting, the time and the way time skips and lingers in feeling. I thought this form might stage an essayistic argument that meandered and swerved, even as it staked claims and took stabs at meaning. I created variable breaks across each page. As you can see on this slide, italicized phrases that often interlock, that somehow falter or swerve away from each other. And I tried to make the poems mimic the way time skips and lingers in feeling. I wanted the form to toggle between continuity and segmentation, just as we desire to belong together, while we also have to insist on questioning the values that get attached to our bodies, our kinship structures, our desires for the future. There are other forms in the book too, including a section that remixes some of the language from publicly available sperm donor profiles and a dismembered and reassembled version of Shakespeare's Sonnet 1. But today I thought I'd focus on the joints and themes of the prose poem part and read from those. So here's an example of what the prose poems look like, and I'll just leave these up on the screen while I read an excerpt from the first section of the book. And that first section, like the book itself, is called The Sacramento of Desire, and it opens with an epigraph from Claudia Rankine's book Plot. Plot, of course, meaning a land. It could mean land, it could mean, you know, a story, something at the heart of fiction. And Claudia Rankine writes, or too soon, whose womb rhymes with plot. I rented the opening only as far as the adjacent walls. This is corporeally true. Sacramento was green like smoke, cranking big bolts of energy with actual smoke, welding its lines shut. Still, there's the way you make S's on paper and the way I make S's on paper. Apparently ease is tough to deliver. Like when you commented on the earnings and that hurt my feelings. A big bracelet is a big pain, Dottie says. I have everything I need to write alongside, wait for the next adjective, wait for the next line, be not necessarily headed toward disaster, not necessarily forward thinking or reined down or stripped clean or subject to a heavy infection, not holding out for objects, more like drawing lines around the feeling in sugar, chalk white and infuriating. Absent all that, to say the walls became infected with color disturbs the logic of sight sense, but you knew that once you tore your retina and got charged with error. There's mint on the tongue, but that taste isn't written down anywhere. Ceramic chip lodged in the finger, glare coming off the lucite waiting room at the Hollywood walk-in clinic. Snip, snip. This is not some moment sailing toward the future. It's not on paper or lining a coffee table, scratched in ink, embedded in fiber, or even starting to be a machine. And couldn't, no matter how you tried, really be a machine. Her head is filled with machines. One locks into her eyes as they rotate and refocus. And then the machine quits trying to be agency and starts to be machine. This joint is also made from bone. The machine desirous of being a flat plane, made of words again, something else budding out from under that skin, like Jodorowsky's flower, or your eyes like a phoropter, will it to be? As you snap your hands open back in East Hollywood. I'm not trying to be angry or punchy or in charge, just trying to tell the story. Around the corner from the elementary school, cacti stretch over the writing table like lamps. It's easier to write with a low wall between the I and the you, to think about Leslie's vessels before I am once again completely driving to Bakersfield. Today, there's only a temporary little wall of irritability, red and textured, penning us in. The road is killing, my cycle is lengthening. Conjure the notion of a body to make itself into another person, or a body to make itself eat itself from inside, a body for drawing, for example, for moving in and out of the human area, which Alice says is over, yet there is still this body. Curtains of bodies covering each other and the earth. Crank the radio, air quality alert. It's quite a lot of driving from East Hollywood through Angeles National Forest, past Quebec and Bakersfield to Delano and up toward Elk Grove and into Yolo County, swarming, wet, valley to valley to valley, has my feet turned red yet writhing all the time. So you might as well structure the line differently. Peacocks moan in Hollywood forever. A good day to be an amateur orologist when the charts and lines are purely spectral, not like speculation or thinking that happens in two lines. No blood, just other data, non-animal, non-bone, non-blood, non-skin. Then a form of thinking that digs scratches into a plate in Brooklyn where we collected names at New Year's. Vulva on the table. Anatomy is just as calendrical. Santa Monica Boulevard cuts, gluttonous sand, total allergy, i.e. California. At the window, orange crystal on pink crystal, remember the corner of the Brooklyn Museum, flush, round, flared up, threaded edges slapping against the painted wall. What needs to happen before we can chart progress? We have all the necessary materials, glass, paper, salt, wood, cloth, protein, tin, mucus, rose quartz, hermetic seal, blood, obviously a different kind of protein, more salts maybe, no barrier, jittery and lunge. We see time through glass, although it hasn't arrived yet. I guess we're imagining memory walks the halls of another museum where the docent intoned, we know this tapestry was made after 1492 because Hercules is holding a round world. On my powers of manifestation. I wished that winter would never end, and then it didn't ever end. So I wished that the eminent scholar would leave the room, and then the eminent scholar did leave the room, and then I could see that my powers of manifestation were great. So I wished that I would have the wished for thing, and people turned a bit embarrassed from me, but I could feel their acquiescence to my powers of manifestation. So I wished for this, to get this done, just to get through another one, to get through one more one, to get this one done, to get done with this one, just to arrange this one into position, just an idea of the other one, wait to get through this one, to hold that one, each day and night, just this one more and once more, wait. And you can believe we're listening to the Good Girl mixtape. Confessing, do we admit to a failure or a desire? Julie asked. The winter rain shoves the glyphosate and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons down into dull ground. And in Bakersfield, I take empty saddle to Westfield, to Quail Ridge, to Wide Loop. And the next morning to Larry Citrus Field spit me out again. Running by the dry ditch, I peer up at the morning's inversion layer. Something's pinker than the lens should allow. No, I don't think it's supposed to be that pink. No, it can't be that pink. That pink is an alarm. There's something infected in the glass. There's a weight getting attached to that pink in the glass, not normal rain, but different in texture, like a valley is a depressed angle. It shouldn't be pink there. It shouldn't look pink right there. It should be stripped clean. As you are in your car and I in mine. It's not my anger anyway. It's not going to solve all our problems. Like neighborly limbs pandering outside the Venice Beach skate shop. We're all just working with what we have to lose. Wasted face of the gemstone, terrible taste behind the teeth. You can't go out that way. Use an article instead of a possessive, and that unrelievable pressure will click off like a gun. Bernadette called her book Memory, but it's not a book on memory. It's a book on presence. We are lengthening the contract of reading. Behind the graveyard in Hollywood forever, two animals murmur, or do something louder behind me. The remains of that fire, and then a wet pivot. You only get a future child. Who said anything about an animal? Who said anything about a pivot? There is no beast in a forest, just 4 streaks of light beyond that palm, and the body incubates curved space, laps at its own cortisol, testosterone, gonadotropin, a hole to hold someone clean as smoke. An egg is a genre. An assemblage is a body from which there is no escape. Watch some sort of giant maiden on the screen, tick, tick, tick on steel, impregnable. None of our secrets are physical. We just continue tearing at our cubicles. Listen, it'll be okay to talk into the machine. Just hold it up to your face. Yes, just like that, a city lung. And the language is so very careful. Get real serious about tone, because she had a dream about a telescope accordion, and you scoured the pawn shops for something that was lasting, but it got infected. Time to test your human chironic gonadotropin. I mean, your corrupted chironic download. I mean, your freeze and your thaw, your granuloside beating up on the lens. I thought that to look critically at the language was to look critically at the rest of the experience. Make the optics bigger than you can describe. Life in the follicle is so banal. As heat flickers down, dogs bark, light stretches past the air conditioner. We swallow pills to interrupt infection, to heat the lung, to confront the animal in the road. Yoga's inevitable lunge, inevitable pigeon. You have the wrong numbers in that chart. The date's wrong too. Lost here like a phone tree. A private form is a soft form. A soft form is a soft organ. A soft organ is a lost limb or water. She used to love the blood once. They repeated and repeated. As feathers are not flowers, and we're drowning in time. Craig's poem about what does not change crams into the article about endocrine disruptors and into the plastic guts of the albatross chick in Allison's poem, and the absolute dark of the pelvis in Allison's other poem, and the empty sack in Dottie's poem, and the flapping sack in Monica's poem, and the eggs practicing theory in Laura's poem, and the cervix and the eggs practicing rot in Vanessa's poem, and California looking like the skin of a person in Brenda's poem, and the methodical machine of the uterus in Laylee's poem, and the tipped word in Margaret's poem, and how she was not yet dead in Camille's poem, and how I thought we were a biotrope together in Latasha's poem, and the waist-deep fossilized patterns in Claudia's poem, and the charred cloth in Susan's poem, and the forehand improvisation in Linda's poem. And in 1808, Ensign Gabriel Moraga of the San Francisco Company named the river Santissimo Sacramento, which is a kind of blood. And we drove 15 miles west toward the mountains. And everyone knows toxic sunsets have the best colors. And we're about to walk around the bend of the sentence and out the other side. First one passage, and then another, strewn with rotted red leaves and just a tad weepy at the injection site. Bring another concern into this analogy, a true red dead end, because the future is red like clay and reddening more by the hour. Don't mourn, canonize. Watch blood wash into the needle, line up the next calendar. A drained muscle is an empty form. It would be a relief then for a cell to die, iron out the pulse as in water. Cramp, no cramp, cramp, memory, fear, awry, perceptible laugh in the cunt. May I log on to this terminal while we wait, clots, smear, bye-bye, dancer, purple scarf, sandwich maker, clutch of cells, each with its discrete corridors. I've got it right here in my pocket, draped in muscle, this story, blink. And I think I'm actually going to change my mind and read I'm just improvising because I didn't plan to read from another part of the poem, but I feel like I want to punctuate that excerpt with a different like terminal punctuation mark or whatever. So I'm going to read part from a section called Intramural from the book. And in this section, which takes a different form, it's written in line and alternating italicized and non-italicized lines. And it's a form that I borrowed quite heavily from Lisa Robertson's book, Face, which is thinking about taking language from the archive and remixing it so that the distinction between like the present text or whatever and the archive begins to blur in really interesting ways. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from this section. I drag an archive of icons across the desktop. I am always drawn to wilderness. I square the massive lines, their accumulated gossiping cells. My grandmother planned to become an engineer, but got pregnant and left university. I sift through a bank of encircled content. I loved being read to every night, blunt personhoods, masticated, resembling. I am very curious about different subjects, coy icons winking in pure blue light. I probably read about 400 pages a week. They're lines and squares enfleshed by my ones and zeros. I take a multivitamin, or their own desires evacuated by the rules of this display. I am a lover. These icons, once fleeting, now are named in a grammar. Each icon's grammar is struck from the float forever held in solution. The grammar of each identical in its system to pointing, yet each also disassembling into variously boxy and curved bands. One kind of grammar, like real blue light, now smooth in ordinary genre. If I were a graphologist, I'd chart calm, clarity, conscientiousness, constancy, cruelty, or curiosity, full lower zones for eroticism, upright script for diplomacy, high loops for abstract thought, or the velvety tones of an interviewer stroking the icon's grammar toward a state beyond raw or washed or informed consent, a unique state, a like state, a state approaching mine. What other ethical solution might we measure as a tincture? A body to make another person where thought is the making? But no grammar is plain. No grammar can simply be traveled like a wall. And does the soul really say, double me? And does that doubling just peer through the glass, ready to be fixed like a problem or a bone? And I'll stop there. Thank you so much. Thank you for your silent clapping.
Thank you, Julia. This is the first time I've heard you read it, and I've read it, and it's like, so I feel like I need time to like think about that, like what I thought in my head and versus what it is.
Yeah, me too.
Well, yeah, we've talked so much about this. I should have said that in my intro too. We had planned to, host a book release for you at the time. So this is like a much delayed book release, and it's just lovely to hear you.
Oh, thanks.
I was gonna see if we have, yeah, folks can, we're a small enough group. I think if you want to unmute yourself and, we can open it for a discussion or just, thoughts, or Julia, if you have anything that you want to add, just love to have a conversation. You can also feel free to write in the chat.
I'd like to ask Julia a question, I guess, but although first I want to thank her for doing this.
Thanks, Bob.
I'm yeah, in the notes to your book at the end, you have the statement that all poetry is bibliographic. And I must say, as a librarian, it made my heart beat faster when I read this. I love that. But it did make me also curious about your use of other poets, phrases from other texts, I guess. I don't even know what the proper term is, reuse or recycle or whatever, but the range of reference, at least by my standards, is quite enormous, in these texts. And I'm just curious about how you do it exactly. Do you have some sort of commonplace book type thing that you write as you read other poets' work, or you somehow pull it out of your memory bank, or when you're working on your own text, how do these things emerge?
Yeah, so you're asking a great question about process, and my answer is not that interesting, which is sure. I have a commonplace book or a journal or a reading notebook. Sometimes it's a physical journal, sometimes it's a obsessive word file or whatever. And I would just say too that I think I am one of a kind of poet who is maybe always writing in response to others, like always finding myself kind of sparked by whatever it is I'm reading. And I always enjoy thinking about how like one slogan is maybe no language is neutral. For some reason, the on brand is popping into my head, but also like no language has come out of nowhere, right? Like all language is in dialogue with other language. And so it's always been part of my practice. And then the question becomes what does it look like? How to format it? And in my first book, everything was scrupulously italicized if it was taken from someplace else. And that was a form that I borrowed most heavily from Dodie Bellamy, who didn't come up with that. She didn't invent that style, but she was a poet that I was very influenced by. And I enjoyed in the letters of Mina Harker how the look of the italics on the page looked like sort of foreign text bubbling up into the main stuff. And then as I kept working, and I don't think Dodie does this either quite so much anymore, I started to abandon the italics, play around with other ways of differentiating the language, and then became interested in like, what are we doing when we differentiate the language? What do we lose when we lose the differentiation? Both like, what are we trying to prove when we format it and emphasize it, and what gets lost in a productive way so that something else can emerge. And so then the other big question, of course, is citational practices. And I had a really great, when I was working on the book, I had a great conversation with Brian Tier about this, because his work is also what I would call very bibliographic in this way. And he had a very similar conversation with his publisher that I had with mine. I think my publisher let me get away with a lot more notes than Brian's let him get away with. But both of our very, astute literary publishers had the perspective that these are books written for, I don't know, there's, the books can easily be overwhelmed by citations, or by the idea that there's like a decoder ring at the back that will explain the compositional methods and the citational practice. And so there's something to be said for letting go of some of that impulse. I can't let go of it entirely, because scholarship is also part of my practice, and it blurs a lot with the poetic practice. So I'm interested in it being a difficulty, or like a productive problem, a tension between responsible citation, because that's another big part of it for me. It's like, I want like a responsible level of acknowledgement of the language of others, but also an acknowledgement that it's not about mastery or about comprehensiveness somehow.
Hey, Julia, how are you?
Hey, Landana, how are you?
I'm great. I'm one of the lucky people here because I got to hear Julia read from Sacramento of Desire right before the pandemic hit. So
I think that was like the one and only event of my book tour that happened in person. Yeah.
Amazing. So I love Bob's question. Actually, I'm going to follow on a little bit with it, if you don't mind, even though your answer was so comprehensive. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you feel that, it's a two-part question, do you feel that modern contemporary poetry is often more referential than some of the more classic poetry? And then when you were just talking about form, I especially like the Monica Yoon piece that you read from and what sort of form she's using. How do you feel about new forms? Like, are we still continually creating new forms? So one is a very specific question, and one is a very, what do you think, Dr. Bloch question?
Yeah, so in answer to the first question, I think, yeah, I would think certainly like the maybe second half of the 20th century, early part of the 21st has seen a tremendous rise in something that could be loosely grouped under the idea of documentary poetry or research-informed poetry, poetry that is citational, informed by supposedly non-poetic texts. Some of the most recent and probably well-known examples being like Norbese Phillips Zong, Mark Nowak's Coal Mountain Elementary, Rachel Zolp's Janie's Arcadia. So poetry books that are taking texts that were not intended or aren't supposed to be taken as literary, and sort of digesting them and reassembling them into literary texts, but also in a way that again blurs that line between literary and non-literary text. I don't feel confident saying there was like a definitive break. Like there's definitely more of it now than there used to be. I suspect that scholars of documentary poetry have lots of interesting things to say about documentary elements of the poetry of earlier centuries. And in terms of the new forms, yeah, I mean, just to stick with the big umbrella term of documentary poetry, I think there are more and more interesting things happening in that universe of forms all the time, and books that are coming out that are playing with the idea of either like really research-based poetic practices or otherwise poetic practices that have something urgent and important to say about the contemporary, about the political, about the social, about, you know, cultural textures. And so, yeah, I think there are lots of possibilities for new forms coming out of that imperative, and all sorts of ways in which we're continuing to expand our notion of what form is. Like there's not just received form and free verse, you know, obviously, but there are lots of different ways to experience form and lots of different ways to experience non-poetic forms that can come into the poetic, or like ways that poetry can discover and point out and identify forms of being and belonging and collectivity, and dramatize those in really exciting, interesting ways.
Jed has left a question in the chat. I don't know if he also wants to ask the question.
It does. I was just bookmarking it in case anybody else wanted to jump in on Mandana's question or say something about California. But Julia, the silly version of the question is just like, what does California mean to this book? But I hadn't heard this framing, this Black Acre Monica Yoon framing before, and it feels like there's a large tenor vehicle relationship between bodies and reproduction on the one hand, and plot and land and kind of development and futurity baked into land and landscape on the other. And that, I mean, there's so much going on in the dense, formal, verbal work of the poem, of the book. But I guess what I'm wondering, if you could isolate, if it isn't too alienating to you to do so, is not the California of your own experience, which is to say the private ways in which you're marking places, I assume, that you worked your way through and traveled through and thought about. But is there a kind of metaphorical value to this geography in particular? And that's why I put all the Spanish names in the chat, because once you got into the Blood River and I thought about it back against the Black Acre, it felt like there was a story there unfolding that I was kind of partially tuning into. But anyway, can you muse about that at all, the specificity of California and its sort of land meaning in this work?
Yeah, I think I definitely have more thinking to do through those connections. And it began with a corny pun, which is that the Sacramento of Desire is a pun on Linda Gregg's book, The Sacraments of Desire. And I have like no relationship to Catholicism whatsoever, but I just kept turning this phrase over and then wanting to start with it as a kind of quasi-accidental conceit, and then allow it to open up into something else. And it coincided with what I was thinking about when it came to certainly like California vistas and California tracks of development. My second book, Valley Fever, was named after the Central Valley, and thought a lot about what sets that landscape apart in terms of ecocide and tremendous devastation alongside rabid development and production and productivity, and all the ways in which the land and the people are compelled to to churn out and produce as much as they're kind of getting ruined in really dramatic and visibly dramatic ways. Everything from the inversion layer in Bakersfield that you see as you descend from the Angeles Forest, to the phrase Valley Fever, which refers to this endemic lung condition that is triggered by the specific combination of pollution in that region. And I'm interested in how that, or in that book in particular, I was interested in how that collated with fictions and narratives of California as this site onto which especially US imagination project these visions of the future. If I were more of a historian, I would have a more historical answer to that question along those terms. But those are like all of the signposts that I'm kind of looking at as I consider that question and draw those connections for sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So Sophie Lewis, the great Sophie Lewis, has typed a question in here and is going to stay off voice.
Would you like me to read the question or?
Sure, yeah. I'm just reading it to myself, which is not entertaining for anybody. So yeah.
I'm happy to read it. And so we can feel free to type anything if I'm getting any, if
Oh
you
no,
feel
it's
like
fine.
adding.
Actually, I've just realized my situation has resolved temporarily. I'm just gonna use voice.
Okay.
Sorry. Thanks so much, everyone. Apologies. I guess sorry, it's such a, yeah, I didn't mean to make such a thing of it. So yeah,
No.
I've been mulling humorousness and comedy in your book, Julia, because one of the things that I don't know, maybe people do talk about this, but it's just a really funny title, I think. I mean,
Thank you, Sophie.
I mean, but
I do feel like people don't laugh enough at the title.
Yeah. And I think, well, I've also been thinking about humor because I love it when people notice funniness, particularly with women writers. It still seems to be a thing that people don't see or comprehend, and it's somehow contradictory of profundity, or people think it might be somehow, but it's not. It's the opposite of contradictory of, anyway. So yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, would you like to talk about something comedic about your craft? And would you say, I mean, this is a really open question, I don't know, would you say there is campiness in some of your writing in this book? Yeah, I guess that's my, obviously I've been thinking about like the queer art of failure, the way you interact with this kind of fertility industrial complex, and the way that produces a sort of noir effect, and with the absurdity and the bathos of all these things. But maybe there's other things about camp to be said, or not. Maybe it's not a category that is correct here, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it is a category that would be super interesting to think about in relation to the book. And Sophie and I were on a panel at MFA right before the pandemic, and I gave this paper where like the first page or two of my paper was just listing all of the images of how terrible it is to be infertile throughout literary history. And I meant it as an absurd accumulation of basically horribly misogynist imagery. And I meant for it to be laughed at. And so there is an aspect of the book that is wanting to use maybe a bit of, there's something campy about the humor, or at least wanting to be parodic in a way that can undermine some of the, really tired tropes that attend this topic being fertility or assisted reproduction or infertility. Apparently it's Infertility Awareness Week or month or something like that. I saw that on Twitter and I was like, I saw that and I thought, I don't think we could be any more aware of infertility as a tremendous opportunity to make lots and lots of money in this country. I don't think awareness is the problem. Right?
Could I just, something else popped in my head. There was a reviewer of someone who blurbed Tori Peters's book, Detransition Baby, said that what she appreciated, as well as irreverence about certain things, was Peters's quote, reverence for motherhood. And that just kind of struck me as wrong. I thought, that's really silly. I mean, although I do think, I mean, it made me think, and I have a piece coming out on this, but like, what I love about the title is also that it has the sacred in it, and the idea of sacrament somehow, which is how like infertility always has to be discussed with a straight face, bordering on a kind of like really sad face, like
right.
Very great. Anyway, that's all.
Right.
Yeah,
I like that. And I think yeah, I mean, I don't know, Sophie, I think you and I might share a little bit of this sensibility of finding it really productive to use humor to undermine some of the norms that we're all trying to fight against without it being somehow, I don't know how to articulate this exactly, but there's something, you know, and I feel like I'm thinking through this in the research project as well, but attend to the like very real and lived affective attachments that we can have to these institutions, even as we are really, really interested in having a critique of them, right? Including, you know, the fact that when you want to make a family, you have to follow some rules to some extent. And even that word family, you know, brings with it so much baggage. As much as we desire to remake it or make it differently, or make it in a way that that can do something different and think about future differently. And I'm really, really interested in that ambivalence and in focusing on the ambivalence in a way that can be productive and interesting and creative. And so I think when you're a poet scholar, you get to approach a scholarly project in a way that uses creativity in a particular way to ask those questions. So I feel very lucky to be in that position.
I love that point, and I wanted to maybe follow up on that and see if you could talk about then some of the connections. Well, just to say, like, maybe to back up from it and say, like, one of the things that I really loved about hearing you read it and hearing you explain more about like your use of italicizing and the way that worked was like the sense of urgency. Like maybe you were writing this, maybe like you were choosing the way that you were writing to like come across that way. I mean, as somebody who, you know, many of you know who know me, spent a lot of time clocking reproductive time, that kind of urgency that comes with the like constantly like clocking and making sure that you're always on this like schedule that's determined. And for those of us who are not like, or who are lucky enough not to be in a very Western medical context, to then be forced into that is very like jarring. And so like using that to kind of also force you into that style was something that I thought about. Full disclosure, also knowing nothing about poetry, so I'm kind of winging it here. But that's what it brought up for me, like as somebody who has experienced that. But I would love for you to then maybe talk a little bit about like this project, and then as you're writing with the other project that you mentioned at the start, and like what's that like then to be like exploring this topic, both through this poetic forum and then through the forum for the project that you talked about at the start, and like what are some differences and what you wanted to pick out from the new project that maybe is you weren't able to do in this form, or you weren't even thinking about doing in this form.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that comes to mind is a question about genre and process, and that maybe goes back to Bob's initial question about where things get to live and where they get to be recognized. The Reproductive Time project right now begins with a reading of Let Her Speak, which is a book published by Counterpath Press, which is a transcript of the Wendy Davis abortion filibuster in Texas. And that filibuster consisted of Wendy Davis talking for, I can't remember how many hours now, you know, but to stop this horrible abortion bill, which eventually would get passed, but it took longer because of her filibuster. But in the filibuster itself, she was the content of the filibuster was about like time of conception and how difficult it is to pin that down according to linear time, and yet so much of this legislation hinges precisely on the idea of time of conception. But then she was also using the genre of the filibuster to delay the vote and you know, stand on the floor without leaning on anything, without drinking water, without peeing. She someone put a back brace on her, and then there was a long deliberation over whether that consisted of break in the rules of the filibuster. And so she was using a lot of the practices that we might recognize from durational art practices to say something about temporality, even as she was, or as she was also saying something about the way temporality gets weaponized around reproductive justice. And then it gets published as a poem. So what does that mean? What makes it a poem? You know, I'm not that interested in intent versus how something is received or published, but I am interested in what can make a text like that poetic, and how it could be poetic, how it could be read as poetic, alongside other works that, you know, their authors would say that they are doing something poetic. And so I think a lot about genre and duration, and I think a lot about how much durational practice can be a framework, I guess, to understand the lived experience of reproduction or family making or kinship making, whatever route that takes or whatever shape that takes. But also, I guess, research and creative practices, and how they're durational, and maybe there's a relationship between the durational and genre that is interesting. These are all questions of categorization and like indexing and what gets called what. And so in the lyric book, I'm thinking a lot about how lyric has always functioned as this very slippery term. Is it a genre? Is it a mode? Is it a style? And that it's slippery is not necessarily the most interesting question, but why do literary scholars and poets turn to it as a slippery term, and what do they gain from it? And so in that book, I'm looking at like kind of excavating some of the narratives that attend the word lyric and the work that those narratives do to shape the poem's approach to experience, and specifically subjectivity, and who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. And so it's a book that is trying to think through the relationship between poetic form and subjectivity in a very literal and broader way, I guess. And so that's a book that is, I guess, maybe following the, I think, very productive rules of scholarly practice. But the new book, I imagine, or the newer project, I imagine crossing those lines a little bit more between creative practice and scholarly practice. But and then again, like enacting some of those problematics around genre and what boxes we put language to, and how the way we put language into boxes relates to how we put ourselves into boxes, or how we get ourselves put into boxes by others.
Thank you.
I have a question. Hi, Julia.
Hey, Ryer.
Hi. It was really exciting. Every time I hear you talk about this book, I feel like I'm getting such a wonderful education, and I'm very, very grateful for that. I wanted to ask you about, I guess, like environment in a sort of like broader sense. Like I was, writing down some of the like lines that were amazing, like total, again, back to the humor of like total allergy, i.e. California. I thought that was hysterical. But then these moments of talking about the Santissimo Sacramento, which is a kind of blood, the idea of toxic sunsets having the best colors. And I wanted to ask about, wondered if you could talk about the sort of process of like experiencing these things, but then also like taking the role of an observer, and sort of recording these things to sort of show how they are both like lovely and unlovely and beautiful, but also sinister, and the sort of process of like being in the middle of that and having it happen to you, but also like recording it in the manners that you do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the way you phrase that question just gives me like this beautiful map to answer it, because you're pointing out, I mean, you didn't say this explicitly, but going back to what I was saying earlier about the broader spectrum of maybe I don't know why I said maybe, the broader spectrum of a documentary practice, one of the central questions is, well, who is the poet in all of this? And that poet might be a person, might be loosely identified with whoever happens to be speaking in the poem. But even if that poet is not, it's an important ethical question that needs to be attended to and isn't always attended to in a lot of poetry books, especially if those, or a lot of poetic work, especially if that work is, using the tools of appropriation instead of the tools of documentation. So a lot of those works that I mentioned earlier, like Nerbese's or Rachel's, or Alison Cobb's book Plastic just came out from Nightboat, and that's a book that I quote from in the book, and Alison's other book, Greenacre, is a book that I quote from in the book. So those are three poets at least I can think of. Another one is Divya Victor, whose book Curb is coming out in just a few days, also from Nightboat. Our books engaged with, as you say, place and situation, and don't skirt the issue of who the I is speaking in those poems. So resisting the idea that when you write about people and places and problems, you can take on this neutral stance or this non-critical ethnographic stance, but instead poems that want to confront that problem of the speaker. And I don't literally mean that there has to be a speaking I in the poem, but I think the poem needs to acknowledge that it has that the speaker has a situatedness, or the perspective has a situatedness, even if that situatedness is being interestingly problematized and questioned in the poems themselves. So that's kind of a slant answer to your question, which is really about maybe place, and it sounded like you were talking about some of the stuff about ecocide in particular in the book. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Yeah, does that answer your question, Briar? I feel like I kind of wandered off into something else.
It gave me an answer I'm very glad to have. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Can you give space for one more question if anyone has something that they're well, I think maybe we can wrap up. Thank you, Julia, so much for this talk. It was really, really beautiful, really wonderful to hear. And thanks everyone for coming. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you may be.
Thank you so much. Great to see you all.